It was 7:42 a.m. on August the 17th, 1943. Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. Technical Sergeant James McKenna was crouched under the left wing of a P-38 Lightning, watching his pilot prepare for a mission he probably wouldn't survive. The pilot was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, 23 years old, a farm kid from Iowa. He had flown 6 combat missions. He had 0 kills. And today he was flying straight into a formation of 18 Japanese Zeros. By all military logic, Robert Hayes was a dead man walking. The P-38 was a beast, fast, heavy, and powerful, but it had one fatal flaw that was killing American pilots every single day. It couldn't turn. Against the agile Mitsubishi Zero, the P-38 was a brick. If an American pilot tried to turn with a Zero, he died. That was the doctrine. Dive, shoot, run. Never turn. But James McKenna knew the problem wasn't the pilot, it was the machine. Hidden deep inside the twin booms of the aircraft, there was a defect. A tiny 3/8 of an inch slack in the control cables. A factory tolerance that created a split-second delay between the pilot moving the stick and the plane actually moving. In a dogfight, that delay was the difference between rolling inside a Zero's turn and getting shot down. So, the night before, Sergeant McKenna had done something incredibly dangerous. He didn't file a report. He didn't ask Lockheed for permission. He grabbed a pair of pliers and a 6-inch piece of scrap piano wire. He broke every regulation in the Army Air Force manual to install a stupid homemade trick inside Hayes' plane. If it failed, the plane would crash and McKenna would face a court-martial. But if it worked, it wouldn't just save one pilot. It would change the entire air war in the Pacific. This isn't a story about an ace pilot. This is the story of the mechanic who broke the rules to save him. The killer was hiding inside the twin booms. Deep in the fuselage, the P-38's aileron control cables ran a marathon distance. They snaked from the cockpit back through the booms of the tail and forward through a series of pulleys to the wings. And hidden in that complex web was the secret that was killing them. Slack. It was tiny, maybe 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. To the engineering officers, this was irrelevant. They pointed to the manual. Within factory tolerances. They said the slack was necessary for thermal expansion. But McKenna knew better. He knew it by sound. When he plucked a tight cable, it should sing, a high-pitched twang. But on every P-38 in the squadron, the aileron cables didn't sing. They thudded. That thud meant a fraction of a second delay between the pilot moving the stick and the wing actually dipping. At high speed, it didn't matter. But in a dogfight at low speed, that delay was a death sentence. The worst part for McKenna wasn't the mechanics. It was the smell. Every morning, the maintenance area was filled with the sharp scent of aviation fuel, hot metal, and hydraulic fluid. To McKenna, it became the smell of doom. It was the smell of machines being prepared for men who wouldn't come back. He watched them walk out to the flight line. Good men. Kids, really. Climbing into cockpits with confidence, trusting a machine that McKenna knew was too slow to save them. The first warning came on July the 9th, 1943. Lieutenant David Chen. He was a kid from Sacramento who bonded with McKenna over working on hot rods before the war. Chen went up for a fighter sweep. He came back 2 hours later, shaking, with 3 bullet holes grouped tightly on his left boom. He told McKenna he tried to roll out of a turn, but the plane felt slow, like there was a lag. The Zero had anticipated the delay. McKenna patched the holes, but he couldn't patch the floor. 3 weeks later, over Rabaul, David Chen got into another turning fight. The delay returned. He didn't come back. Then came the ace, Captain William Morrison, a flight leader with 11 confirmed kills. He knew the P-38's limitations better than anyone. On August the 3rd, Morrison intercepted 8 Zeros over Oro Bay. He tried to execute a defensive split S. His wingman heard him over the radio. "Controls feel mushy." The Zero stayed on his tail through the turn. They shot him down at 4,000 feet. The official report said pilot error. McKenna knew it was a lie. It wasn't the pilot, it was the 3/8 inch of slack. But the breaking point happened on August the 14th. It involved Lieutenant Thomas Parker, Robert Hayes' wingman. Hayes watched from above as 2 Zeros locked onto Parker's tail over Finchhofen. He heard Parker screaming on the radio that the plane wouldn't turn fast enough. He heard the panic, then the gunfire, then silence. Parker was 21 years old. His bed in the barracks stayed empty. 2 days later, on the evening of August the 16th, Robert Hayes walked into the maintenance hangar. He found McKenna working late. Hayes was desperate. He had watched Parker die. He knew he was next. He looked McKenna in the eye and said, "Is there anything you can do? Anything at all? I don't care if it's regulation." McKenna looked at the kid. He smelled the hydraulic fluid and the fear. He told Hayes to go get some sleep. McKenna waited until the hangar was quiet. Then he opened his tool bag. He didn't take out a wrench. He took out a piece of scrap wire he had scavenged from a wrecked rudder. The time for factory specs was over. The maintenance hangar went quiet at 2300 hours. Most of the crew had gone asleep. The only sound were the distant rumble of generators and the buzz of insects hitting the overhead lights. The air was heavy with the smell of engine oil and tropical humidity. McKenna walked up to the Hayes P-38. He pulled the inspection panel off the left boom. The metal was still warm from the day's sun. He reached inside. He grabbed the aileron cable with his grease-stained fingers and pulled. He felt it again, that sickening 3/8 inch slack. It felt loose. It felt wrong. He opened his tool bag. He didn't take out a standard part. He took out a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire. He had scavenged it from a P-38 that had ground-looped 2 weeks earlier. It was part of the rudder trim system. He didn't know why he kept it then. He knew why now. He sat on the concrete floor with a pair of pliers. The wire was stiff. It fought back. On his second attempt to bend it, his hand slipped. The sharp steel sliced his thumb. Blood dripped onto the wire, making it slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept working. It took him exactly 8 minutes to bend the wire into a perfect Z shape. This wasn't an engineering fix. It was a jury-rigged inline tensioner. It was designed to add exactly 0.4 pounds of payload to the cable, just enough to eat the slack without snapping the line. Installing it was the hard part. The space inside the boom was tight. McKenna had to wedge his shoulder against the metal structure. The edge cut into his arm. He could feel sweat running down his back. He held a flashlight in one hand and worked with the other. Shadows jumped across the cables. He disconnected the pulley junction. His fingers fumbled with the clevis pin. Clink! The pin dropped into the darkness of the boom. McKenna froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. If he couldn't find that pin, the aircraft was grounded. If an officer walked in right now and found him searching for it, he was finished. Court-martial. Prison. He spent 5 agonizing minutes feeling around blindly in the dark. Finally, his fingers touched cold steel. He found it. He inserted the Z-wire between the cable end and the pulley. He forced the clevis pin back through. It was a tight fit. When it finally seated, he tested it. He pulled on the cable. Twang! The cable sang. No slack. The control surface moved instantly. McKenna replaced the panel. He cleaned up his tools. He wiped the blood off his hands. He walked out of the hangar at 1:15 a.m. The night was still, broken only by the distant drone of Japanese night raiders somewhere in the dark. The sound made his stomach clench. He had just violated a dozen Army Air Force regulations. If that wire snapped during a high G-turn, Hayes would crash, and McKenna would be responsible for his death. He went back to his bunk. He didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling until dawn. At 6:30 a.m., he walked back to the flight line. At 7:42, he watched Hayes taxi out. He watched the P-38 join a formation of 16 others. He watched them head northwest towards the Japanese airspace. And then all he could do was wait. The engagement started at 8:14 a.m. Hayes' flight of 4 P-38s intercepted 9 Zeros at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. The morning sun was behind them. It was the perfect setup for a standard diving attack. Hayes was flying number 3 position. His element leader called out the bounce. They rolled in. Hayes picked a 0 at the back of the formation. He drove from altitude, building speed at 380 miles per hour. The 0 grew large in his gunsight. He could see the painted rising sun on the fuselage. He could see the pilot's head in the canopy. He pressed the trigger. The 4.5 caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon hammered. A 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the 0's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The engine exploded. Kill number 1. But there was no time to celebrate. His wingman screamed over the radio. 0 diving! 6 o'clock high! Hayes looked up. 3 Zeros were coming down in a shallow dive. They were fast. They had seen him kill their friend, and they wanted revenge. Hayes shoved the throttles forward. His instinct screamed at him to climb, to run. That was the doctrine. But the 0s were faster in the dive. If he ran, he died. His only option was to reverse and fight, to do the one thing a P-38 wasn't supposed to do. He rolled hard left and pulled back on the stick. That's when he felt it. The airplane responded instantly. There was no mush, no mud, no fraction of a second delay. It was like someone had removed invisible weights from the wings. The P-38 snapped around 90 degrees in half the normal time. The lead 0 pilot wasn't expecting it. He expected the American to run. Instead, he was staring down the nose of a P-38. Hayes pulled lead and fired. He hit the 0 in the left wing root. The wing folded instantly. The plane tumbled. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The other 2 Zeros tried to scissor with him. This maneuver was usually suicide for a P-38. It involved alternating sharp turns to force an overshoot. Usually the P-38's control lag meant the pilot was always a half second behind the 0, exposing his broad wing to gunfire. But not today. The other two Zeros tried to scissor with him, alternating turns to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed, his P-38 snapped into the turn instantly. The piano wire was holding. The slack was gone. 1 Zero made a mistake. He reversed too hard and bled too much speed. Hayes got inside his turn. He was close, maybe 200 feet. He fired. He couldn't miss. The Zero came apart in mid-air. Debris slammed into Hayes' right boom, shuddering the aircraft. 3 kills. The fourth Zero ran. Hayes didn't chase. He was low on fuel and ammunition. He climbed back to altitude and headed home. The entire engagement had lasted exactly 7 minutes. Hayes landed at Dobodura at 9:03 a.m. McKenna was waiting on the flight line. He watched the P-38 taxi in. He looked for the wire. It hadn't snapped. Hayes shut down the engines. He climbed out of the cockpit. His hands were shaking violently. His flight suit was soaked dark with sweat. He walked straight to McKenna. He didn't talk about the Zeros. He didn't talk about the kills. He said 2 words. It worked. Hayes and McKenna thought they were alone. They weren't. Captain Frank Mitchell, a flight leader of the 475th Fighter Group, had watched the entire fight from 15,000 feet. He knew every pilot in the theater. He knew Hayes was good, but he wasn't that good. Mitchell saw the P-38 snap roll like it weighed half what it should. He found Hayes in the debriefing room. Hayes was still shaking, filling out a combat report for 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell asked him one question. What did maintenance do to your bird? 2 hours later, Mitchell found McKenna. The sergeant's hands were black with grease, his coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid. Mitchell asked for the truth. McKenna looked at him for a long moment, then told him, the piano wire, the unauthorized tensioner. Mitchell didn't arrest him. He asked for the same modification on his own plane. He told McKenna, regulations can wait. I've lost 4 pilots this month. That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's aircraft. The next morning, Mitchell flew it. He came back raving. He told his wingman the truck drove like a sports car. The secret spread like a virus. It moved from pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic. By August 20th, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft. By early September, 40 P-38s in New Guinea had the illegal wire. But they had to be careful. The modification was still strictly against regulations. If a gleaming piece of non-standard piano wire was found during a formal inspection, the entire squadron could be grounded. So the mechanics played a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Before a scheduled inspection by the engineering officer, the crew chiefs would crawl into the booms, remove the Z-wires, and return the cables to their factory spec slack. The officer would inspect the plane, sign off on it, and leave. 10 minutes later, the mechanics would crawl back in and reinstall the wires. The pilots knew. The mechanics knew. Nobody told the officers. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group at Gusup, heard the rumor and modified 4 aircraft in his squadron. The results were mathematical. In July, American pilots lost 2 P-38s for every 1 Zero destroyed. By September, the ratio was nearly 1-to-1. The Americans weren't flying differently. Their machines were just finally fighting back. Then the Japanese noticed. On September 3, 1943, Japan's top ace, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, 64 kills, engaged a P-38 over Wewak. Sakai used his trademark trap, bait the American into a turn, then snap back inside his radius. He knew the timing perfectly. He knew exactly how long a P-38 took to roll. But this P-38 defied the laws of physics. It reversed instantly. Sakai barely avoided a head-on collision. He had to dive away, confused and frustrated. The psychological impact was devastating. For 2 years, Zero pilots had owned the sky. Now they were fighting an enemy they couldn't predict. They didn't know about the 6-inch wire. They just knew the Americans had become impossible to shake. By the end of September, the Zero had gone from hunter to hunted. But while the Japanese were figuring out they were losing, the U.S. Army Engineering Command was trying to figure out why they were winning. And they didn't like the answer. By October 1943, the wire trick wasn't just a rumor. It was an open secret that was creating a massive headache for the brass. A maintenance inspector at Dobodura had noticed inconsistent tension readings across the squadron. He traced the discrepancies to the unauthorized piano wire tensioners and filed a formal report. That report went up the chain of command and landed on a desk in headquarters. It sat there for 3 weeks. The officers were paralyzed. Technically, McKenna and every crew chief who copied him should have been court-martialed for tampering with flight controls. But pragmatically, the tampered planes were the only ones coming back alive. The question wasn't whether the wire worked. The kill ratios proved it did. The question was how the Army could admit that a 23-year-old sergeant with a pair of pliers had outsmarted the entire engineering division of Lockheed. In November, Lockheed finally sent an engineering team to New Guinea. They didn't come to arrest McKenna, they came to study him. They ran stress tests on the Z-wire. They calculated the load factors during 4 G-turns. They realized that McKenna's stupid 0.4-pound preload was actually a stroke of intuitive genius. It kept the cable taut, just enough to overcome the friction of the pulleys without stressing the airframe. Their conclusion was damning for the bureaucracy, but vindicating for the mechanic. The modification was safe. It was so effective that Lockheed realized it should have been part of the original design. This field data was rushed back to California. It directly influenced the control system updates for the P-38J-25 block, which entered production in December 1943. The new models featured a hydraulic aileron booster system that solved the problem permanently. But for 6 critical months, the months that decided the air war in New Guinea, the only thing standing between American pilots and death wasn't hydraulic engineering. It was James McKenna's scrap metal. The victory in the air came at a terrible cost on the ground. While Hayes and Mitchell were racking up kills, McKenna was paying a different price. The stress of the illegal fix weighted on him physically. Every single time a modified P-38 took off, McKenna stood on the flight line, watching it climb, terrified that today would be the day the cable snapped. He knew that if a single wire failed, if a single Z-bend straightened out under pressure, a pilot would die, and the investigation would lead straight to his toolbox. He stopped sleeping. He lost weight. His hands shook until he picked up a wrench. But that fear forged a bond between pilot and crew chief that was sacred. Hayes didn't just trust McKenna with his plane, he trusted him with his life. The other pilots felt it too. Lieutenant James Watkins, the crew chief from the 49th Fighter Group who copied McKenna's trick, saw the same intensity. When his pilot got his first kill after 8 weeks of failure, the pilot didn't go to the officers' club to celebrate. He went to the maintenance tent. He brought Watkins a bottle of whiskey and drank it sitting on a tool crate. They knew. The official history books talk about the P-38 Lightning as a marvel of American industry. They talk about the air superiority and kill ratios. They don't talk about the grease-stained fingers bending piano wire at 2 a.m. They don't talk about the blood on the hangar floor. McKenna stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946. He watched the war end. He watched the planes he fixed fly victory laps over Tokyo. And then, without fanfare, he packed his tool bag and went home. He left the war behind, but he kept the secret. Technical Sergeant James McKenna's name appeared nowhere in the official reports. He received no medal, no commendation, no official credit. The Air Force Archives credit Lockheed Engineering Analysis for the solution. The war ended and the men scattered. Robert Hayes survived. He flew 63 combat missions and shot down 11 Japanese aircraft. He returned to Iowa in 1945, married his high school sweetheart, had 4 children. He spent the next 37 years working as a crop duster. He spent his life flying low and fast, trusting his machine. But he never forgot. Every single year, on August the 17th, the anniversary of the day he didn't die, Hayes picked up the phone. He called McKenna in California just to say 2 words. Thank you. Frank Mitchell survived. He became a squadron commander during the Philippines campaign and finished the war with 16 kills. He stayed in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1963. For the rest of his career, he told every young maintenance officer under his command the same story. Listen to your mechanics. Sometimes the guy with the grease on his hands knows more than the engineer with the degree. And McKenna? He stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946. He moved back to Long Beach, California, and opened his own garage in 1948. He fixed car engines for 42 years. He never bragged. When customers asked about the war, he just shrugged and said he was a mechanic who fixed airplanes. The story might have died with him, buried under decades of silence. But in 1991, a military historian researching P-38 field modifications found a discrepancy in the old maintenance logs from New Guinea. He found repeated references to wire tensioners that didn't exist in the manual. The historian tracked McKenna down through veteran registries. McKenna was 73 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage. When asked about the wire, McKenna confirmed it. He didn't think it was a big deal. He said, "It was just something that needed doing." The historian ran the numbers. Based on the survival rate improvements in the 475th and 49th Fighter Groups after September 1943, he estimated that McKenna's stupid wire trick had saved between 80 and 100 American pilots from certain death. McKenna said he never counted. He just remembered the faces of the boys who came back. James McKenna died in 2006 at the age of 88. He was buried in Pacific View Memorial Park in California. His obituary mentioned his service. It mentioned he was a mechanic. It did not mention the piano wire. It did not mention that he had single-handedly changed the tactical balance of the Pacific Air War. But his garage in Long Beach is still there. Different owner now. If you go into the back office, there is a faded photograph on the wall. It shows a young mechanic in overalls, standing next to the left boom of a P-38 Lightning. On the back, written in pencil, August 1943, New Guinea. That picture is the only proof of how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees, not through manuals, but through a mechanic with a pair of pliers, a piece of scrap wire, and the courage to break the rules to bring his boys home. If you think heroes like James McKenna deserve to be remembered, hit that like button. It helps us rescue these stories from the dust. Subscribe to keep history alive, and let us know in the comments, who is the unsung hero in your family history? Thank you for watching.